Hi folks! Today we're going to be installing the Cajun Gunworks hammer kit and over travel trigger. I'm starting with the pistol almost completely disassembled, but if you want to know how I got to this point, just watch the video through and work backwards. Here we're looking at the ejector, which is really part of the firing block. The ejector is the part sticking out from the firing block. What's inside the ejector / firing block is the Sear spring, and firing pin block lever. Here's the bottom side of the ejector / firing block. To begin, locate the Sear pin on the side of the ejector block and push it out. Keeping in mind that the Sear spring is under pressure and may go flying. After the Sear pin has been removed, the Sear and firing pin block lever can be removed from the block through the bottom. Now if you want to know which side is the bottom, if the ejector is facing towards the ground, then you're looking at the bottom. Now that the parts are out of the block, we can get a better look at them. The old Sear, which is black, is sitting next to the new Cajun Gunworks Sear. And here's the old firing pin block lever next to the new one. I'll be installing the new Sear and firing pin block lever with the original Sear spring and Sear pin. With the block in the upside down position, place the Sear in the block with the flat of the Sear facing you. When the block is flipped over, you should see the safety adjustment screw. That needs to sit in the pocket located on the top left side of the block. Next comes the firing pin block lever, which is placed in from the top of the block. It is placed to the right of the Sear with the hook extending towards the back of the block. Next is the installation of the springs in the Sear pin. Now, I don't know if this is how others do this, but this is how I install these components. I first place the Sear pin in the block. I then back the pin to about the halfway point in the Sear. This allows just enough space for me to place the Sear spring in without having to have a third hand. The Sear spring should be installed from the top side of the block, with the long end of the spring resting on the block and the shorter end on the Sear. A little wiggling and finagling may be in order to get the pin through. To install the firing pin block lever spring, I do virtually the same thing. I back the pin off until there's just enough room to get the spring in, and then I slide the pin into place. Once all the springs are in, a function check of the Sear and firing pin block lever should be in order. From the bottom side of the block, the Sear should be actuating towards the top of the firearm. With the block flipped over, so we're looking at the top, the firing pin block lever should also actuate towards the top of the firearm. Next I'll be installing the Cajun Gunworks over travel trigger. The disconnector pin is easily drifted out and should not be hammered out. The trigger has two holes. The disconnector pin is placed in the lower of the two holes. The trigger bar should be oriented so that the 2 points on the back of the trigger bar are up and to the rear. The point at the front should be pointing down towards the trigger. The disconnector pin can then be placed through the trigger and trigger bar. The next step is to install the trigger spring into the trigger using a slave pin. One end of the spring is oriented down and behind the trigger. The other end of the spring is in front of the trigger. I'm using a punch to get the spring into the neighborhood of the pinhole. Then I had to break out my third hand as the spring is very tight. Using a punch, I manipulated the spring so that I could slide a slave pin into the trigger. Now, without a slave pin, installing the trigger spring will be very difficult. A piece of steel or aluminum rod cut to the width of the trigger should work fine in a pinch though. Our next step is replacing the factory hammer with the Cajun Gunworks hammer. We're going to start by removing the disconnector pin from the mainspring sled. Yes, it's really called a mainspring sled. And the other weird thing is, I noticed there's 3 disconnector pins total on the exploded diagram. Now, my best guess is that they're all the same pin and they're completely interchangeable. Back to it. The pin retaining the mainspring sled and disconnector are tight and will need to be drifted out using a punch and hammer. Once those are out, we can put the disconnector and mainspring sled on the new hammer. I'm starting with the mainspring sled. It should be oriented in the hammer so that the bend is facing towards the hammer face. And as before, I'm starting the pin partly way in to make locating the holes easier. The disconnector needs to be installed so that the flat on the disconnector touches the flat on the hammer. The disconnector pin was being a bit stubborn, so instead of pounding away and possibly damaging the pin, I used tape on the jaws of a pair of large pliers. Then I simply squeezed the pin into place. This method works well on small or slightly stubborn pins, but shouldn't be used if the pin is definitely not going in. Next, I'm going to be installing the slide stop spring and pin. The hook on the front of the spring should be oriented down and towards the front of the pistol. The V-bend in the spring should be fitted into the slot cut into the frame. I used a small screwdriver to compress the spring enough for the pin to just clear the top. I then used a nylon-headed hammer to get the pin in the rest of the way. Now, it's important to note that simply trying to drive the pin into place without compressing the spring below the pin could damage or break the spring. I'll next install the magazine release, magazine catch spring, and trigger bar spring. Install the magazine release with the 2 notches facing the front and right of the pistol. Next, place the magazine catch spring into the frame with the 2 ends going into the notches cut in the magazine release. This is where I will point out that I totally botched this, as you can see by all the apprentice marks left on the inside of the frame, which will now require me to go back and re-cerakote the pistol. So learn from my mistakes and use either a wooden dowel or nylon punch to maneuver the spring into place. The next step is to install the trigger bar spring. The trigger bar spring should be installed so that the opening of the hooks are facing down. Both springs should sit on the shelf that is machined into the slide. Finally, the screw can be screwed into place, and a small drop of blue, not red, but blue Loctite may be used to ensure the screw doesn't wander out after firing. Next, I'm installing the trigger and trigger bar. The end of the trigger spring that is facing forwards will need to be placed into the small hole in the frame. Ensuring that the slave pin is aligned with the trigger pinholes on the frame, carefully drift the trigger pin into place. I'll next install the hammer. Ensure that the main spring sled is installed going through the small round hole that's towards the back of the frame. Next, drift the hammer pin into place, and if you haven't lost it yet, place the hammer pin retaining pin into place. Make sure that the hammer pin is in place before placing the hammer pin retaining pin. Otherwise, the small pin will fall through and end up in the black hole of gun springs and pins. Next, I'll be installing the safety, ejector block, and the safety latch, which is the tiny ball. Place the ejector block into the frame with the ejector pointing forward and align the hole in the block with the safety hole in the frame. Place the safety into and through the frame and firing block, stopping just shy so that the safety latch ball can be sandwiched in between the frame and the safety. I usually hold the ball into place with fine tweezers and then push the safety in the rest of the way. It also helps to have the pistol flat so the safety latch ball won't want to roll away as much. The flat spring is installed with the open end of the hook down and facing towards the rear of the pistol. The flat spring pin can then be drifted into place. The mainspring slips over the mainspring slot, and the plug is then drifted over the spring with the cutout of the plug facing the rear of the pistol. With a punch or dowel, compress the mainspring into the frame and the hook of the flat spring onto the plug. The flat spring will need to be sandwiched in between the frame and the plug. With the flat spring in place and the mainspring compressed, align the plug so that the plug pin can be drifted into place. Now simply screw those grips on and function check the pistol. The new Cajun Gunworks Sear will need to be adjusted to ensure that the safety functions properly. I hope this video helped you. Thanks for watching.